常有幸请来了Professor James Evans 大家欢迎。那首先呢，我先针对我们这个系列活动做一个简要的介绍。这个是我们极致俱乐部和腾讯研究院举办的叫做 AI and Society 这个系列活动的第12期了。然后呢，我们这个系列活动的一个主旨就是在寻求这样一种交叉学科的碰撞。一方面呢是这个技术、大数据、人工智能等等这种科技，那么另外一方面呢就是我们的社会科学。那这两者之间实际上有非常多的这种交叉和碰撞。我们以往的第11期节目已经给大家带来了非常不同的各种各样的主题。那么今天呢，我们的主题再次回归所谓的计算社会科学 （Computational Social Science）。正如大家所知道的，这个计算社会科学呢，它也是在试图用一种基于大数据这样一种方式来重新去研究一些经典的社会学问题那么今天呢，我们请来的嘉宾就是 James Evans。那么 James Evans 呢是芝加哥大学社会学系的教授，是科学学就是 Science of Science 复杂网络知识社会学的世界级知名学者。毕业于斯坦福大学，曾在哈佛大学从事社会组织结构方面的研究，在芝加哥大学创立知识挖掘实验室，并主持了芝加哥大学计算社会学硕士项目。主要兴趣包括群体智能、社会组织结构分析、科技创新产生和传播规律等，曾在Science、PNAS 等等顶级这个刊物上发表过大量的文献。那么跟 James Evans 教授认识呢，也是来源于他的博士后，也是我的好朋友，就是吴令飞。那么在去年的大概是这个春节前期的左右时间，我们也是请来吴令飞来给我们做了一系列的这种讲座和报告。所以呢，在这里面呢，也是隆重的就是邀请James Evans 教授来给我们做今天的这个报告。好，有请。
Okay, let's do this. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be at Tencent again. What's up? Oh, it's okay. The slides will come. The slides will come. So I'm delighted to be here at Tencent. I think it was either 2014 or 13 when I was at the Tencent kickoff of the Institute for Internet and Society here in Beijing with my daughter, and had a wonderful time learning about the exciting work that they were doing. And since then, I have a postdoc who's kind of connected with the Swarmer Club, and so I'm really delighted to be here and talk a little bit about today the topic of social computing, I'll call it. My name is James Evans. I'm a faculty in sociology, computational science, the business school at the University of Chicago, and at the Santa Fe Institute. And I run a little center called Knowledge Lab, where we're really focused on bringing together large-scale data, machine learning, intelligent crowdsourcing, and smart, compact models that enable us to, on the one hand, represent knowledge at large scales, and beliefs and opinions and perceptions, and then to understand them, to do what I'll call a kind of a big data science and knowledge studies, to really understand at scale, how people think, what choices people are making, how those end up accomplishing their purposes. And then, especially in the context of science and technology, how can we use, for example, biases, heuristics, patterns, flocking patterns, swarming patterns, by which agents in science and technology and other creative endeavors how can we turn those on their head, right? So how can we use those as statistical instruments to identify and search through places which are otherwise unsearched, otherwise invisible? And so really the hope, the search is for a computationally enhanced knowledge about knowledge. So I'm going to just talk a little bit today about a vision for what I'll call social computing. What is social computing? What isn't social computing? On the one hand, it's really about using computing and computation for understanding the social world from the many digital traces that we leave behind as we walk through commerce and search through our relationships online and offline, leaving these digital breadcrumbs along the way. We can use this kind of computational social science approach to both understand, gather data, turn it into to things that are analyzable and operational, and then make sense of it through computational and statistical modeling methods. The second is a second understanding of this kind of ambiguous term is how a recognition that the social world is in some sense computing its own understandings. Right? As people engage with one another, as they make inferences through the collective, as they respond to each other's choices and opinions and adjust. And so this kind of comes from this world of complex systems where we're using computational metaphors to understand what it is that the social world is in fact already doing and computing. And then finally, a synthetic piece, right? So this idea of how we can kind of compute with the social, right? So how we can engage in sociality through computing, how we can connect in extreme ways ensembles of humans and computers to fulfill our purposes. And so I'm going to kind of walk through each of these pieces and give some just a taste of some of the research that we've been doing in these spaces as examples, but talk about possibilities and future pathways. So first I'm going to talk about computational social science, what it is and why it might matter for individuals who are interested in society, but also why it might matter for businesses who are really focused on building services that provide value for individuals. So the banal perspective is it's just using computers to generate data, discover patterns, generate and test explanations that you could not have without them. But that could not have without them is a non-trivial twist. It implies a shift in computationally enabled research designs, methods, and their entailments in new standards. So before 2000, it had a certain meaning. So people talked about computational social science, but it really meant this program of building digital societies, of using assumptions about the world and putting those assumptions to silicon and kind of computing the consequences of your theoretical assumptions. So this is an example of Thomas Schelling, Nobel Prize winner in economics' micromotives and macro behavior. This is the one of the many games, the famous Schelling segregation game, in which he kind of computed the assumptions of collective behavior as a function of simple preferences about where individuals might live. It also grew to a study of larger simulated societies with agent-based models. Is some rule set enough to generate some social world, the world that we inhabit? But after 2000, and I would say it really got labeled in 2009, there was a different take on what computational social science was about. It was really, I would say, marked in terms of the way in which people thought about it from probably 2008, 2009, this piece on computational social science. And it really is characterized by high throughput experiments, high throughput observatories, high throughput archives, high throughput surveys, and even high throughput simulation. So really, using the existence of, for example, the 24 independent sensors which are in my phone, which are all around us, that are kind of tracing. At the same time, these electric outlets are serving us signal. They're also tracing our use of that signal. Large-scale data through large-scale archives, and of course, this is relevant to the social world. So these are, digital archiving devices, and these are kind of government records, but they're archiving possibilities in other sciences as well. High throughput experiments, right? So kind of using crowdsourcing and other kinds of computationally enabled virtual labs, especially experiments that allow computation, randomization, and algorithmic designs to be used in situ, for example, in the situations that people are living in. And so we can really get rich traces of how it is that people are making important decisions about their lives. High throughput surveys, where we're basically now, instead of just accessing people specifically for a particular research question, in the context of tuning a service or good, we might attach simple surveys. We don't want to waste a bit either of time or of information, and so we'll predict what people's responses are and then use those predictions to optimize the information value of any additional question that we might ask of them, or simulation experiment that we might ask of them. And of course, high throughput simulations where we can raster simple models and small models to large scale data so that we can really simulate and generate traces of the world. So when does big data matter? It doesn't always matter. Sometimes it gives us the wrong answer. Sometimes it provides a distorting frame because it might not be representative of the sample of persons that we're most interested in. But the times when it especially matters are when we care about rare but consequential events, right? When we care about the hit, we hear about viral events that spark collective attention. We care about bridging and network connections which facilitate the diffusion of new ideas or opportunities or services. When we care about novel behaviors or expressions, to capture those, to use those to amplify those in the system. Anything that sits at the tail of the frequency distribution. If we care about those things, then big data is still only modest data. And small data is almost no data at all, right? And so these are cases when large-scale data, these high-throughput observatories and experiments from sitting on social media platforms, sitting on cell phones, really are consequential. So these are, for example, examples of structural virality in email chains, right, or kind of chains of other social content where each one of these links, unique links in the chain, end up being consequential for the ultimate efflorescence and expansion of these ideas. And these are simple images of networks where individuals in these networks end up differentially affecting and influencing the diffusion of ideas, of tastes, of the use of services. A second thing that's associated with this computational social science opportunity is the fact that these unstructured data forms that kind of come in, so text, online, activity patterns, networks of movement, is a demand for datafication, right? So turning these things into objects that can become analyzable. So this is manifest in natural language processing approaches, so text, audio, the massive administration or the massive integration of large-scale records, administrative records, other records, machine vision, signal processing, so images, video, the extraction of objects and scenes and views and videos, social interaction, network dynamics that are extractable from these things. Machine learning in general. So we've got large-scale data tensors that we can reduce the dimensionality of, that we can understand in new ways and scale interpretive judgments. We can use them to sample in new ways. And these are paired with this social analytics revolution. So we've got high-dimensional modeling where we've got cases where we may have more variables that describe an individual than we have individuals in our sample, right? So it fundamentally changes the way in which we can think about these data sources. And so we're using deep learning, we're using autoencoders, we're using matrix and tensor factorization to squeeze that data down in ways that we can analyze and make sense of, to take lasso, random forest, ensembles, to take large scale and sparse data and make it available for us. And also high performance computing approaches. So parallel high performance computing has really transformed the way in which we think, I would say, about scientific questions and answers in the social sciences. When I was going to school at Stanford, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it really felt at the time that the difference between the frequentists who studied statistical events as a function of just their empirical frequency and Bayesians, that it was actually an intellectual difference. And it turns out that it wasn't, right? I mean, when we have computation that enables us to update data as a function of prior data, update data as a function of prior assumptions, then almost all models are incorporating those kinds of update technologies. So these are also facilitating massive simulation, network analysis at scale, which is really unimaginable before, and cloud-based storage solutions. So the fact that you've got these computation over large dispersed data, enclave computing where protected data, special data, data that could reveal individuals' private information is protected, but we have access to its answers by kind of throwing our algorithms over the wall and receiving back responses, so we can work with these data in ways that protect the individuals who contribute it. the contribution of ultimately science as a service, so pipelines that can really automate processes of datafication and analysis, and the facilitation of distributed surveys and experiments. I'm working in Bangalore and Delhi, India right now, where we're trying to understand the distribution of skills in the informal workforce. The informal workforce, so the workforce which is disconnected from social services, is about 92% of the total workforce. So it's the vast majority of the workforce. There's very little known about it other than the inflexibility and the difficulty of people finding jobs outside their social networks. And so, for example, we're using active learning to ask people questions that constantly update as a function of these algorithms that interact with a cloud-based server. So, new data, new analytical technologies, new modes of turning that data into something that's familiar to us in some ways. How does that change the way in which we ask and answer questions? Well, there are a number of theoretical entailments. One is that in a world in which you had small data, you had to spend a lot of money gathering survey, you did focus groups, it was like there was, you spent a lot gathering individual responses from persons, then you needed strong models. You needed models with lots of assumptions so that little data could tell you something theoretically, so that it could give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you were going to make an important services decision, or if you were going to make an inference about how society lived or thought or experienced things. But this changes. When you have large-scale data, then in some sense, it's an encouragement to weaken those models, right? Because you can discover patterns in one set of data, and then you can test them in other sets of data. You have the opportunity to kind of essentially do model selection over a much wider range of models. And so it really encourages us to think much more broadly about the possible ways in which social action is structured. It also suggests that we cede more theoretical intelligence to the algorithms that we're working with in these contexts. And it might even change the way in which we think about gathering data and analyzing data as being two completely separate processes, which, there's a wall between them. It may be that, we leave random samples in the past where we're just kind of doing grid search over the space of possible experiences that we care about. And instead, we're optimizing samples, right? So we're actually getting every additional data point that might be expensive. We're selecting it as a function of what the last data point said about the likelihood of our model, right, of the world, of what we care about. And so this really potentially changes the way in which we think about experiment design as algorithm design, right? So we're thinking about designing the experiment as an optimization to help us understand something about the world. Another theoretical entailment, another way that changes the way in which we potentially think about doing research, and this has enormous, I think, implications not only for the social sciences, but also for social technology, for social media firms, is this generative standard for social scientific epistemology, which is don't trust it if you can't generate it, right? Which really flips on its head at least the maxim that was common when I was in graduate school. There it was, we have a necessary but not sufficient condition, right? We can say that something is causal, it's important, but it only explains about 3% of the outcome that we care about. Who cares? Who cares? It's shifting to kind of sufficient but not always necessary conditions, right? So an encouragement for us to build from data, explain, 90, 95, 99% of phenomena that's in question. Of course, sometimes we care about causes when we want to intervene in the world, then we need to understand causes as well as consequences. But this is a new standard, right? And so it really kind of shifts insofar as we do this well, insofar as we produce sufficient explanations which explain not just part of, but almost all of the phenomena that we're interested in, it shifts us from not just a social science to also a social technology, right? So even if for example, we can sufficiently explain something and we don't have the causes right, then we can build it. We can build a platform, right, that can produce those kinds of outcomes or facilitate those kinds of outcomes. There's a shift from causal inference. I mean, we're certainly interested in cause as social scientists, in explanations that are powerful, but a shift, if we care about sufficiency, if we care about explaining all of a social phenomena, to also prediction. So you know, in the world of cause, we're really focused on this beta that explains the effect of some variable on an outcome. And here there's a shift to focusing on what we call, you know, y hat in the context of this model, right? The predictions of those outcomes. And this has a very clear implication, right? We have to focus, if we care just about causation, then we just care about minimizing bias in our models. If we care about prediction, then we need to minimizing bias with minimizing variance. So it's just it changes the way in which we think about statistics. It also creates a more messy science, right? Because if we want to explain everything, then we typically can't rely on a single mechanism to explain everything, right? It's rare that a single dynamic or single force or a single process is going to change everything. So this is just, you know, two approaches. Mark Granovetter, he was my advisor in 1978, wrote a paper on collective behavior, so crowd behavior, swarming behavior. And Bikhchandani, Hirschleifer, and Welch in 1992 wrote a paper that didn't reference that had a different theory of collective behavior. One of those approaches, the first one, does not assume that there's order in the way in which people look at others' behavior and choose their own. The other assumes that the order is critical, right? That people observe not only the action, but other people responding to the action, and that enhances and changes the way in which they respond. The fact is, it's likely that both of these have an influence on viral behavior. And so it creates a messy standard because now no longer is it a single equation, right? But it's two competing mixtures of equations that explain the phenomena in question. So in the end, there's this kind of synthetic computational social science that emerges from this, where you have competing and combining explanations, where in some cases the best explanation, even the most parsimonious explanation, so the simplest explanation may be a database, right? You know, that might be, you know, which offends our sensibilities as scientists, but it's, you know, if we care about generating phenomena, if we care about sufficiently explaining phenomena, then we must care about the possibility of combined explanations. It may be less intuitive and less aesthetically appealing. It may be less pretty. And we're going to really have to be asking questions about the degree to which this complexity in the social world is an artifact of the world itself or our data and methods. But it also immediately becomes more relevant to policy, it becomes more relevant to products, it becomes more relevant to services, right? Because it's really about sufficiently ending these things. And ultimately, the end game is not that it's just something, computational social science, but it's good social science, right? It just influences and moves the needle in the standards that we have in social science. So the broad opportunity here, I would say, with computational social science is what physicists will call a phase transition, right? Just a change, really, in form and structure in the explanatory and predictive power of the social sciences. So I'm going to provide just a little example of a piece that may resonate with you, may make sense to you. So this was the election in 2016. Yesterday was not yesterday, today, I mean, you know, kind of yesterday, but right now, the polls have not closed everywhere in the U.S., and this was a tough election. It was a fractious election. There was a lot of contention, and it really came at the end of a long period over the last 80 years of increasing polarization in the way in which politicians speak, the way in which politicians vote in America. right? So this is kind of partisanship as a function of the way in which people are talking versus what one might expect from random given the number of persons. This is the increasing partisanship across the last several presidents. And it turns out it's not just in terms of just the way in which people talk, although certainly it is that, which is to say much more today than even 15 years ago. If you hear a senator or a congressperson, a politician in the US, from their words alone you can predict their party in ways that you couldn't have a century ago, 50 years ago. The same is true in roll call votes, so they're voting increasingly in partisan ways. It's not just politicians, however, it's people. So this was a little study we did where we took all of Amazon.com's purchases, so book purchases, and there were conservative and liberal books in terms of just how they were labeled in Amazon. We verified that, but they're not purchased together. So people who buy conservative books buy other conservative books. People who buy liberal books buy other liberal books. This is how those books are co-purchased with all of the science and literature books in their baskets, right, across all the purchase spaces in the US and UK and other English-speaking countries. And what's interesting about this, and this polarization dynamic here, is that basically, even though, so first, there's some political positions or ideologies which are more attractive to certain kinds of science than others. So conservatives like applied science and liberals like more theoretical science in general. But even when they care about the same science, they almost never buy the same book or even the same group of books, right? So this is climatology down here. So these are the conservative books co-purchased with climatology books, and these are the liberal books that are co-purchased. I mean, this is like Madagascar. I mean, like they are not. If they're having a conversation, politicians are people about climate change, about how to think about our biggest, most compelling problems. They are not appealing to the same knowledge base. They're not. There's virtually nothing in common to the discourses that they're receiving. So this polarization is bigger than just politicians. It's a society-wide polarization, and it interacts with other things. This was a paper called "Why Liberals Drink Lattes." So it's not just that it's that there are increasing correlations of political preferences and artistic consumption, music consumption, style consumption. So a sushi-eating, latte-drinking, Volvo-driving liberal. The fact is that there are cultural divides as well. And the question that we had in this research project was just whether diversity, right? Is diversity an asset that needs to be protected? Does it improve decision making as it appears to do in the context of gender diversity, in the context of diversity from different subfields in science when you're attacking a challenging problem or an engineering difficulty? Or is it just a plague? Does it just limit our ability to speak civilly to one another and solve our problems as a society? Is it the result of this big sort where like-minded America becomes torn apart as it clusters with itself? And there has been some very interesting work in the study of teams that suggests that communication factors like listening, even turn-taking, and women who load so heavily on even turn-taking and listening that they form their own factor in improving the intelligence of teams. Are these things present in the context of, for example, bipartisan or politically polarized groups? Can politically polarized groups work together? Because they need to. I mean, this is our world. Are diverse teams smarter than singular teams? Are politically diverse teams smarter? Or do the result of echo chambers where people speak to other people that reinforce their own beliefs create situations where collaborations and communications result in flame wars where they really can't connect? And so we wanted to look at this in an online setting. We looked at this in the context of Wikipedia, an online digital encyclopedia, the largest encyclopedia in the world. And so what we did was we took every individual who contributed to pages And we took the bytes that they contributed to liberal pages and conservative pages over this time, and we reweighted liberal and conservative pages as a function of the people who were contributing to them in a kind of a recursive way. So that, you know, for example, there's some pages that are very popular, so those will attract more liberals and conservatives. But in the end, we got a measure, a conservative Bayesian measure, and by conservative Bayesian measure, what I mean is we began assuming nothing about the individual. So once they edit 1 or 2 pages, we still don't know very much about them. But once they edit 153 liberal pages and 4 conservative pages, then we know a lot more. We know a lot more about them. And so we kind of identified this distribution of editor alignments, and we did surveys as well. We identified that this captures a little over 1/3 of their likelihood to vote in a certain way, and a little bit more of their ideology personally. So this is their individual support. We also saw that what's called Linus's law is true. So the more eyeballs you have, the fewer bugs. So pages that attract a lot of attention from a lot of editors are less likely to be polarized in the distribution of politics. So they tend to be a little bit more balanced on average. And these are the kinds of pages, and you can just feel it. You know, I mean, I suppose not all these topics are, but here, the science topics. So the conservative science topics are capitalism, history, statistics versus erosion, human evolution, tropical rainforests, the planet, and ecosystems. So these, at least in the U.S., like these scream, kind of liberal and conservative topics, and all of these do. What we found was, interestingly, that increasing polarization on these teams, increasing political polarization, so the more diversity of political background in these teams, dramatically increased the likelihood that those pages would be perceived as high quality, right? And these assessments of quality across all these pages were independent of the process by which the pages were constructed. And so, at least in the context of Wikipedia, now I'm not saying this is true everywhere, but there was something about this platform and the self-selection of individuals into this platform that suggested that politically polarized groups were much more likely to produce high-quality political pages, and somewhat less likely, but still much more likely to construct social issues, high-quality social issues pages, and even likely to construct higher quality science pages as a function of different kinds of exposures, different kinds of experiences. You know, they're reading different science, they're experiencing different things. Now, why is that true? Well, we didn't know. And so in Wikipedia, there's the front page where people have contributed the final published edits. And behind the front page are what's called talk pages, where people argue about what to include or what to take out from any particular article. And so someone says, Ronald Reagan, a famous conservative politician and president from the early 80s, from 1980 to 1988, people are arguing back and forth about why it was unfair that people had framed his presidency in a certain way, and they provided evidence for the apparent other view. So, for example, he was the first president since Dwight Eisenhower to serve 2 full terms. So this editor thought this was unfair because Kennedy had been shot, right? He'd been assassinated, and so if he hadn't been assassinated, he would have served 2 full terms. And then somebody on the other side says, well, this part is unfair about from a conservative perspective, where there's a criticism that he didn't care about AIDS or the AIDS crisis. He didn't fund AIDS as much as he should have funded AIDS. But it turns out that the critique of that critique is that nobody understood that AIDS was a crisis in the early 80s. And so this is what's going on. This is what polarization is producing, is this intensive debate. So we went through and we pulled apart the informational diversity in these conversations. So, for example, we took the semantic diversity and the lexical diversity, so the diversity of topics that people were exploring and the diversity of words in which they were discussing those topics. So, for example, we took the distinguishing words, so the term by inverse document frequency, so the terms that really are distinctive to this article but rare across the corpus as a whole, to get at the diversity of things that people are talking about. But then we identified the semantic diversity by building what's called an autoencoder, right? So this is a neural network model that rasters, in this case, all of Wikipedia, all of the tens of millions of pages on Wikipedia into a latent space. So two pages that are very similar to one another collapse to the same part of that space. And we identified each page the diversity of conceptual topics that it was describing in terms of Wikipedia topics. And what we found is that what these diverse teams are doing is they're talking about fewer topics, in fact, topics that relate to politics, that relate to the axis of diversity in many more ways, right? In 25% more ways. And so this is really what's driving improvements in this quality. In part, another thing is when you have a balanced, polarized community, when you have people on either side of a divide, then it actually decreases what we'll call the temperature of discussion online. So the temperature is when, you know, you're screaming at people, you're writing capital letters, you're throwing the F-bomb, you know, you can do that if there's like one person on the other side, and that's exactly what happens. But when there's an even community size on either side, then effectively that balance polices politeness. And that politeness is directly related, positively related, for the length of the discussion that takes place, right? So that policing, and this is something that's actually been shown in other analyses, that basically violence is almost always an imbalanced phenomena. So the average visual violence, for example, from police photos and what have you, is 4-on-1. So it's very rare that two equal-sized groups go at it in an altercation, and that's exactly what happens online. We also saw that there were policies and guidelines which were common to Wikipedia that were so well known that they were described by their acronyms. And these were intensively and increasingly used by members of these communities to signal when these norms were violated. We put all these together to identify the relationship between political polarization and the quality of these pages, and really discovered, in some sense, the most powerful effect was the decrease in the semantic diversity and the increase in the lexical diversity, right? So that focus and diversity of experiences ended up dramatically shaping the way in which people thought about these things, and secondarily the relationship between decreasing the talk temperature, as it were, and increasing the volume of debate. Again, this is just one example, but there's so many digital worlds that takes place online. Commerce, exchanges. I'm finishing a paper right now that actually works with Tencent data, where we're exploring the relationship between the dispersion of red envelopes and money and how it ends up influencing cycles of giving, right, across the country. So this, again, allows us new access to kinds of dynamics that have existed for a long time, but may be accessible at scale for the first time. So the second piece in this kind of social computing research program is the idea that social systems are themselves complex systems which are self-organizing, that are evolving, that are themselves computing their own solutions. Society, in this view, is a complex adaptive system. There are multiple components, they're tightly coupled, and then emergent computed phenomena involve things like collective understandings, collective actions. All social action, I would argue, involves some form of complex computing. I won't go into detail. This is just a picture of schools of fish which are responding to this predator, this observer. Could be you, could be me. Ian Cousin has some work that shows that not as individuals, but as a school of fish, they precisely compute the average trajectory of the predator as a function of their relative positions within this space. So people, as a function of their interactions with each other in this networked world that we live in, are themselves engaged in updating assessments that are very similar to the kinds of learning models that we're building as a function of these kinds of processes. I'm going to argue that all computing is oriented to pragmatic action in some way, that there's some objective at the bottom, and that every knower, all knowledge in general, is in fact a complex adaptive system itself, which is involved with, on the one hand, a set of sensors, like we're describing for computational social science, a set of representations, a set of understandings or models about the world, a set of expectations, a set of plans, and that these emit, you can think of these as nodes in this network. The connections between those nodes are themselves these labelable processes which are fundamentally social, right? So measurements are built for ourselves, our future selves, and others. Descriptions are elicited for others. Understandings emit explanations, right? Expectations emit predictions. Plans emit interventions or actions in the world. And all of these things kind of facilitate this collective knowing process. And so really understanding how it is that individuals, but also systems, are engaged in collective knowing really changes the way in which we think about computation and about connecting computation with the social world. So this is a reduction of the scientific space. So here's an understanding, for example, anything where the understanding is basically driving the position of your sensors in the world, right? Or the position and direction of your experiments is a deduction. Anything where the world is generalizing to an understanding is an induction. And abductions are things where you have collisions, where basically inductions surprise an understanding, which you intended to drive your work. And I'll suggest in a few minutes, with some recent research we've done, that this ends up characterizing the way in which we think about science, the way in which we think about innovation, the way in which we think about creative work in a number of domains. These kinds of networks, again, look very much like deep computational models, precisely because that's what deep computational models are producing. So, for example, a deep learning neural network model is, as a function of networking factors that come from some sensor, for example, together, and then sparsifying those, right, by removing links, for example, which are insignificant in the individual submodels, create these little separate ganglia of understandings that only at the end, as a function of them becoming independent modes of understanding, become combined to predict the quantity in question that we want to understand. So I study science, technology, innovation, and in creative domains and scientific domains. A concept that we think a lot about is something called we call the adjacent possible. So it's an advance that's one step away from the current frontier, right? And if we were to think about this in network terms, it's one combination away, right? It's combining, a particular person with a particular opportunity, a particular background with a particular experience. It's combining these things facilitates that next step in this space. Now, if we were to think about all possible combinations, that is an enormous universe, which is larger than any of the universes that we will ever explore and discover. But it allows us to start thinking about how it is that science is a system, that technology is a system, that creative and artistic individuals in those systems search through this enormous space. So, for example, when we look at how things are combined in the context of the sciences, almost everything is close, right, in this network, right? So, for example, if we look at how chemicals are connected over the last 50 years, almost everything is at most distance to. Everything is a friend of a friend. Everything can be reached by connecting with something else. And the same is true even with individuals like authors and new methods. The likelihood that you'll meet somebody else who also has something in common with you and has access to the method in question. Well, when we analyze these things at scale, for example, we find that science as a system is involved in a collective computing process, which has consequences. So, for example, big science searches, individual search, not just taking into account surprise or new scientific opportunities, but taking into account each other, right? So this is a simple model that characterizes the likelihood that a scientist will combine, for example, two chemicals in the research literature. We estimated this from large-scale data over the last 60 years, and we found something very interesting that, and maybe unsurprising to those of you who've spent some time doing research, which is that there's enormous clustering around these dense centers of a particular chemical, right? So this is DNA and bromodeoxyuridine. So this is a therapeutic, and obviously this is much more common in the literature than this. But the idea is that something like DNA, something like some other, really important therapeutic becomes a hub, and people are playing a game. They're not only trying to discover the space of possible connections, but they're also trying to get tenure, get promotion. They're trying to move up in this space. And so what we find is there are consequences for this collective computing in this way. So we actually look at the full space of everything that was discovered over the course of the 60 years that we looked at. This is the efficiency of the empirical estimate, the way in which science as a system is searching across this frontier. So it's very efficient. So this is the experimental cost. This is the number of experiments per kind of published and robust finding. It's very efficient for the first few elements, right? So when you have to discover what those hubs are, it's very efficient at discovering them. But basically, as a result of this social process of identifying what's important as a function of other people that are around you, that people end up staying in these clusters, which dramatically slows the speed of science. So we're able to find alternative strategies that don't take into account those social demands, those social heuristics, and that are able to discover that space of things about 10 times faster. This can be exemplified in other ways. So, for example, one of the things that we were trying to do was to predict all of next year's new inventions and all of next year's papers. And again, our model of a paper and invention is relatively impoverished. It's just a set of elements, right? So it's not the full construction of the object. It's just the fact that it's comprised of a combination of elements. And we use an embedding model technology based on multi-membership stochastic block models of high dimension, but we do this to basically raster each element, every subcomponent in technology, every component in a research paper, every idea in a scholarly investigation into a high-dimensional space. And we discover the optimal dimensions of that space to predict all of the papers that will show up next year, all of the overlapping sets which comprise an investigation or a patent in the next year. And we're able to predict about 95 to 97% of next year's papers, right, of next year's objects, in the same way that it's likely that we could predict that, a high proportion of the number of choices that people make, or the number of tweets that they would make as a function of momentum from the past. But what's perhaps most interesting is that the best model of what's going to be impactful in the next year are those papers and those new inventions which most violate this best fitting model, right? So again, it suggests the importance of fields in driving, schools, departments, commitments of inventors and scientists in studying a certain thing, but a diminishing marginal return to following those things, because the things that are the most successful, and here we're able to predict about 50% of the likelihood of being in the top 1% of citations or retention. So we're able to predict almost all, about half, more than half of the viral events in this system, just as a function of the degree to which they violate fields. They violate these commitments, these crowds, right, which are crowding within other commitments. So this just gives you a sense of the way in which society is engaged in, people are engaged for the many purposes that they're trying to fulfill. They're trying to estimate the right choice to make as a function of the people around them. So just this illustrates this in an interesting way. So these are the likelihood that you will cite a certain concept, for example, in your paper. So just think about your 10th grade paper, and what do I reference? Your teacher says you have to reference some things, so you look through the paper, you figure out, what am I going to reference? Well, scientists reference the things that are most familiar to their audience about 5 times more than anything else, right? Because they know who's going to read their paper, the people who wrote those other papers that they're citing, right? So they're engaged in this instrumental activity for the many games that they're playing. It just so happens, unfortunately, that it makes it much harder to play the discovery game, the advance game in this space. Another example, a more extended example that I'll kind of walk through is the way in which teams, for example, in the context of science, end up shaping, just as a function of team size alone, end up shaping the way in which science searches, the way it gets networked and picked up in the future, and the way it changes and influences unfolding advance. So one thing that's perhaps the most striking pattern over the last 100 years in sciences, social sciences, arts and humanities, and also invention is just the rise of teams. Communication technology, transportation technology, make it possible for people to be and remain connected in ways like they never were before, and it changes things. So this is biomedicine. So the number of people on papers about more than double over the course of the last 50 years, and the number of methods that they use also double. Why? Why do people do it? Well, some people have argued that it's because, scientific advance in the complex world demands it. But when you actually look at what people have investigated, all you can find are really demonstrations that if you are a member of a big team, that your career will be good. That you'll get more citations, you get more funding, you'll have more likelihood of being promoted and rewarded. There's very little evidence about whether this is a good strategy for knowledge discovery and technological invention. And so we were interested in the degree to which small teams and large teams may play different roles with respect to the creation or the solution of knowledge, the problems or the designs, creating problems or solving problems. And social psychology has argued that small and large teams and people on small and large communities play different roles, that they generate more ideas in small contexts. There are technological crowdsourcing venues like Autoencoder, where programmers will compete for a prize to solve a particular problem. And at least in this study by Kareem Lakhani, a colleague of mine at Harvard Business School, he found that when isolated individuals are engaged in searching through this space of possibilities, they stay much more distributed. And the moment you allow them to communicate with one another, everybody jumps to the last person's advance. And so that kind of social computing is really successful if your problem is simple, if it's a smooth problem. That's what we call hill climbing in the context of optimization. So if everybody jumps to your advance, then everybody is at the same point and can kind of walk up. And if it's a smooth problem, right, where every step is continuous, and if you keep walking up, you're going to reach the top, then that's the most successful strategy. Unfortunately, some problems are complicated. And so it's actually more important to keep people isolated and spread out across this space, to not activate the flocking mentality, which is otherwise maybe useful. And so you can see this example in the context of this. This is a scientific experiment that was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2017. This is the LIGO experiment, the laser interferometer, and it's 2 paired observatories in 2 parts of the United States. It was a wonderful feat of engineering and science, but perhaps the most conservative experiment in history. So it tested a 102-year-old hypothesis, and it calibrated its machine, these 2 interferometers, for almost 30 years. The way it calibrated them is anytime it received a signal that violated the general relativity estimate, it assumed that that was a mistake of the machine. So the experiment was designed so that it could not produce surprises by definition. Right? It could only produce the expected result. Again, I mean, it does lots of wonderful things. I mean, it's opening up a new spectra for astronomy and astrophysics. But this is another investigator, a single investigator named Louis Weber, who tried to study gravitational waves. He invented the maser. I mean, he was no mean intellect. Through a single bar detector, right, which was supposed to act like an antenna at sensitivities that people didn't think were conceivable of capturing the signal of general relativity. But he published results that were vastly, wildly deviating from the general relativity estimate that people thought that he was crazy for. He was willing to take risks that this group could not take. Right? This is the largest National Science Foundation funded project of all time, and they could not fail for political exposure reasons. These, I'm going to argue and will demonstrate that they may have impacts on the real or the imagined market. So if you're picking something as a large team that's an established known hypothesis, or you're building on something that is really established, then it dramatically decreases the risk associated with the market. So if you're a film producer and you're trying to decide between an independent script that seems artfully written and touches on a number of interesting and exciting ideas in contemporary society versus Transformers 8, which are you going to pick, right? I mean, Transformers 8 is going to give you the same number of people in the audience that Transformers 7 gave you, right? So so that might not be the best. That might not be the best choice for the artistic history of mankind, right? But it's definitely going to position you in a different place than you would be before. And the reason we're interested in this is because it may be that small teams and the way in which they compute over the source, over the space of possible problems might be important. And if it's important, then it's important for us to understand this. This is basically almost every agency in the US that funds science and technology is betting on larger teams. So is the National Science Foundation of China and these other institutions that I've chatted with because everyone's doing it. So we study this by developing measures of consequences. We look at the disruption of particular papers, patents, software that's developed. We looked at their impact, and we look at the delay with which they're picked up in the future, which we measure in reasoned ways that I'm not going to go into to detail right now. But disruption is the likelihood that you eclipse the things on which you build, that you're seen as a new thing. Delay is just the kind of convexity of attention to your work. So if you're ignored for a long time and then immediately appreciated, then that's going to be a very convex curve. Impact is just the number of citations, and so these measures allow us to distinguish things in ways that we haven't seen before. So all these things have the same number of eyeballs going to them, but they're viewed in very different ways. These are 3 papers. This paper really kicked off a new field of complex systems. This paper received the Nobel Prize. It's a wonderful paper, like the LIGO paper, but Bose-Einstein condensation in a gas of sodium ions. Every time people cited this paper, they cited the theoretical work that took place generations before that expected it. We also measure the search behaviors, the way in which people look into the past. Are they more likely to search deep into things that are popular or unpopular, to search broadly? Simple measures. So we look at this in the context of science, technology, and invention and software development over the course of the last 100 years. And what's nice about these sources is that they are deeply connected with each other. They're networked in such a way that we can look at these patterns of attention over time, and they allow us to look at collectively about 75 million teams over time to really understand these dynamics. What we find is that there's virtually an exponential decline in the likelihood of disruption as a function of team size from 1 to 10, from 1 to 100. This is true in not only in science but also in creative endeavors, in invention, in software development. And you kind of can't break this. I mean, you look at it at any part of the distribution, at any period of time, at any particular field, We can't break it as a finding. What's even more interesting is that it amplifies as a function of the impact of the thing that's created. So for example, really important paper software inventions that are developed by small teams are much more likely to be seen as disruptive, and those that are produced by large-scale teams are much more likely to be seen as kind of developing or confirming. This is especially true in an even more expanded or amplified way in the context of Nobel Prizes, which are much more likely, if they're performed by a small person, to be dramatically disruptive and dramatically confirming in the case of LIGO, in the case of Bose-Einstein. This is true for all fields that we will look at it, and it's also true for people within people. So about 66% of the effect is within people as they move from small to large teams. So they themselves are shifting as basically the size of their school of fish changes. And what we see also is that delay index, that sleeping beauty index, dramatically increases or decreases as a function of team size. So basically what big teams are doing is they're finding yesterday's hits, right, like Transformers 7, and they are, they're like building on them, they're attracting their audience. Small teams are much, much more likely, if they succeed, to succeed further in the future. There's no market that's there for them. They're taking risks fundamentally. In some sense, these are risks that large teams can't afford to take. But the impact for society ends up being substantial. So the effect reverses at 20 years. If you want to invest in the things that are going to be the most impactful in the next 5, 10, 15 years, then you'll invest in large-scale teams. At year 20, that flips. So these aren't marginal effects. These are huge effects. And the same is true about how they search. So smaller teams are not constrained to yesterday. They're much more likely to search more deeply into the past, into much less popular items in the past. And all these patterns are consistent with patents, with software. They're amplified by things like large-scale prizes. They're deadened by things like large-scale funding. So the more funding you give a group, the less likely it is to generate impact. And so, there is a story about essentially bold and broke individuals in this space, in innovation space. We also pulled apart different types of contributors in these teams. So people who were designing experiments and programs and research, and those who were just executing small parts. And we found that effectively the more brains, or the higher ratio of brains to muscles in the system, the more innovative, the more muscles, the more conservative. But even more so, the delay was very different, right? So it actually took a lot more time for more brains to construct and produce their innovations, their inventions, their artistic works, than these large-scale teams that were efficient and rapid, but producing things that are much less likely to disrupt. We see the same thing in the context of other sciences. In the context of 21st century physics, we look and find that more connection between and collaboration between scientific groups. This is an embedding of all the collaboration among scientific groups that produce papers in 21st century physics in a hyperbolic space where things at the center are very central and connective with everything at the periphery. And we find that changes in this end up collapsing the space of topics that people explore. So more connection ends up dramatically decreasing the space of cultural content that people are exploring. So this is just, some taste into how it is that understanding complex systems as themselves computing devices allows us one step further towards thinking about how we can ensemble them together, how we can put, individual and collective thinkers and algorithms together. So extreme human-computer interaction. And so this is the final piece, and I'll move relatively rapidly. One thing that's clear from looking at machine learning models over the course of the past few years is, but also at looking at extreme ensembles, right? So ensembles of humans and machines together, are that ensembles rule. You know, that complex ensembles produce better services, that the diversity of the components is critical, and that also the kind of delayed aggregation of those elements is also critical. So I'm going to tell you just a couple of stories that illustrate this. In the 1980s, humans beat computers at chess. In the 1990s, it wasn't clear. In the 2000s, machines always beat humans. And then in 2005, we have this interesting case where a website called Play Chess hosted a free chess competition. The competitors in this competition could be any combination of humans and computers, right? And who knew who was going to win? You know, it could be Hydra, which was this new chess-specific supercomputer. Could be grandmasters. It could be grandmasters paired with enormous machines which were custom built for them by IBM and other powerhouse computational engines. But the winner was a surprise. It was a team called Zach S. It was two B and D ranked chess players from New Hampshire. They were poor chess players, and they had 3 computers, like off-the-shelf, desktop computers, and 4 simulators that were purchased from Toys R Us. But they beat the Grandmaster Vladimir Kostyrev with an enormous single-engine computer. They dramatically beat the Hydra and these other chess-specific supercomputers because they had the best system, right? As a system, and in fact, I mean, not only did they have the best system, they also didn't look like a single chess player, right? To another grandmaster, they looked like a mess, like a crowd of disconnected players. So just, the argument that these human-machine ensembles are really the things that drive advance. Kaggle is another data science website where, hundreds of data competitions are competed for all the time to produce things for industry, for science, for medicine, for game playing in chess, for traffic improvement. And what's striking about these is that ensembles always win, right? There's never been a non-ensemble model that's won one of these competitions. Random forest initially always won with handcrafted features. These are thousands of decision tree models which were initially added together. Gradient descent boosting are these handcrafted features where you build a model and then you build another model that basically predicts and overweights the errors from the former model. So basically you're building diversity into your sequence of models by building on the prior model's errors. And neural networks, which are really about building your own features, where you've got millions of models, logistic hyperbolic tangent, or other structures of models, which are really building out their own independent understandings in these spaces. A playful example of this is the Netflix prize, where Netflix gave $1 million to the team that could produce a 10% increase in its Cinematch algorithm. The Cinematch algorithm was intended to increase the likelihood that they would recommend movies to viewers by 10%. And so this was supposed to go on for 6 months, $1 million bounty. People got involved, but they couldn't figure it out in 6 months. They couldn't figure it out in a year, or 18 months, or 2 years. At this point, people are starting to drop out of the competition. People are starting to get bored. People are wondering if it's ever going to succeed. But in the beginning of the 3rd year, the first team, which was the Bell core team, the Bell Labs team, they had a really nice model of people that were like each other and movies that were like each other. And they used basically what's called a matrix factorization to identify, as a function of those similarities, what's the likelihood that, if another movie is like a movie that you like and another person is like a person that's like you, then can we predict this missing piece? So they had that model, and the 3rd place team, an Australian team, had a really effective model of new life events. What's a life event? It's when you get a boyfriend or girlfriend who's now using the service. So it's no longer one person, there are two people watching the movie, or you have a kid, and so Barney is being watched with the Revenant, and is it one person that's watching Barney and the Revenant? No, it's two people. So they basically predicted, the disidentification of nodes and movies that were not like each other. When you added those two together, it dramatically improves the likelihood of the model. And then within the next month and a half, you had an entire collapse of the top 50 teams into two teams, and they both, within 40 minutes of each other, produced an answer. What was critical in this ensemble was that the teams weren't communicating with each other, right? That they built separate models that were very different from one another, and so the result of what's the ideal ensemble? It's not like Star Trek's Borg. So I don't know if this, has anyone seen Star Trek before? Does anyone know what this reference is? I see like a couple of pinkies. So I'm okay, someone in the back, thank you, thanks, okay. So Star Trek's Borg is this kind of machine that controls the humans that are connected to it, and the reason why its butt is always kicked in the end, why people always beat the Borg, is because it's completely networked and all people are kind of like consolidated in the same big global mind. There's no diversity in the system, and it always says resistance is futile, but resistance is never futile because the humans are always able to, as a function of their diversity, able to beat it. And so the best network, the best ensemble is always going to be, in some ways, an ensemble of persons and machines, software linked to human data and hardware, and it could be a situation in which you have humans that are integrating machines, that are integrating humans and their answers, which are integrating machines that are integrating humans. So how can we use these principles to build systems that compute answers and services and information and directions that we want? In fact, there are a number of companies that are playing with this, that are trying to do this. One final empirical example that I'll provide is in the context also of science. One of the things I do is study science and technology. But one thing that is talked about a lot in the science press right now, and has been for the last 3 years, is a crisis of reproducibility. So in biomedicine, genetics, in psychology, in other places as well, but those are the places that have been hit hardest. There's been this realization that much research doesn't replicate, right? And so we're spending billions of dollars on research, and people are performing it and getting advanced careers, and it's not producing much knowledge. So we wanted to understand this, so we went out using computers and extracted tens of thousands of claims in the research literature about the relationship between drugs and genes, right, which is a critical component of biomedical treatment. And what we found was a little bit encouraging. We found that agreement predicts robustness. So there are more people who say that a drug influences a gene in a certain way, that upregulates or downregulates a gene relevant to disease, that it's more likely that those things will replicate. So we lined up all of these 70,000 statements with the results of this huge high-throughput computer experiment. Now, the computer was actually performing a wet lab experiment with a robotic arm, or a sea of arms. So we have this huge, massively replicated experiment, and we're lining up all of these former experiments that were performed by scientists. But when we look at the connections between those scientists, so we look at so each one of these things is a paper, for example. And so each one of these experiments, the lines on this are proportional to the number of authors that are shared across those experiments. The lines here are the number of methods that are shared across those approaches. So you can think of these as really devices, in many cases computational devices. And these are these lines represent the number of exposures to prior knowledge that were shared across these systems. And we looked at the centrality with which, for example, one method or one author was contributing or touching all of these experiments. We found that all of that effect, that beneficial effect of agreement with more people, all of it disappeared as a function of social connections using the same methods, often computational methods, and using the same or having the same exposures to prior knowledge. So, for example, there were cases where you had a system, a community of scientific teams that had produced 50 papers, 60 papers that made a claim about a particular drug-gene interaction, which were no more likely to be true than a single investigator in their closet performing a single analysis, right? And so, so in this sense, and we can show, the effect of social and methodological disconnection on the likelihood of identifying things in the literature. Now, this relates in a very deep way to the way in which we think about ensembling methods in computer science, but it extends them to the way in which we should think about them in humans and computers working together. So, there are approaches to bagging, so averaging, for example, or sampling data, randomization, boosting, which I mentioned before, or stacking, where you're kind of predicting which learners are best for which contexts. It turns out when we take into account not only the number of different learners, but the different computational approaches algorithmically, and the different exposures, right, the different social experiences, then we do much, much better. And so the conclusion, this is Stan Lee, the American kind of comic artist who created characters like Thor, the Hulk, and others, is that, and he's keeping them from fighting each other here, right? He's separating them. The ubiquitous connection can crystallize and kill understanding, right? Polarization drives competition, polarization motivates, that more connection between, large-scale overlapping teams and large-scale communities in biomedicine decrease their robustness, decrease the speed with which they analyze their findings. But the broader notion is that there are these deep complementarities across the modalities of social computing, or the different interpretations of social computing, that computing for understanding the social world, or computational social science, allows us to think about the social world as computing its own understandings through a modeling of these complex systems in deep ways that then reinforce our ability to compute and understand the social world. These things together allow us to think and imagine richer ways in which we can compute with the social, and we can engage in and accomplish our social values through computing with extreme human-computer ensembles. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.